Follow for your intervention. You know, the issue here, as what Deborah pointed out, in terms of demand-driven, very much embedded in the issue of legitimacy. Because what kind of what demand do you talk about? So we'll talk about, when we talk demand-driven, we're dealing with government-to-government relationship. Therefore, the issue actually is the legitimacy. What is legitimate? And when you talk about in-country system, and which conflict with the reality, with the reality of accountability. When you use the in-country system, actually it conflicts with the accountability, because actually, according to presumably, when you go to the aid, when you go to dispense your aid as per everything in the country, you're going to see, we're going to trust the country system. But actually, you're not going to trust because of accountability issues there. So that is all kind of contradictions within the northern paradigm, and also with the southern paradigm as well. You know, we all contradict ourselves for this. Anyway, so Diana, you, and after you, and then we go these lines. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. First I would like to add a little bit about this ownership. And there's critical thinking about these ownership issues that conceptually it's very ambiguous. And when we think about this South-South cooperation, we think, too much focus on ownership might be escape of kind of responsibility. And we try to blame the recipient country if the aid is not working. And we are working on a very micro projects, and we try to evaluate the performance of Chinese aid projects in 3 different countries. We find, actually the ownership didn't play a very positive role. The country ownership, we can see the country system, it's not playing a positive role on the performance of these aid projects. So we need to reflect that. And concerning this topic, new approaches to development cooperation, I think in the last few days, I learned a lot about the diversity, multilateralism, and all those kind of uniqueness, sustainability of South-South cooperation. But the issue is how to operationalize this. And in the context of South-South cooperation, I think 3 points we need to really guide to this operationalization of this. The first one, we need to emphasize the experiences of Southern providers. When we conduct development cooperation, I think it's a reflection of our social, cultural, economic experiences. And if you look at Chinese projects in different partner countries, we focus on infrastructure because infrastructure did play a very important role for China's development. We usually see if you want to become rich, you need to build roads first. And then I think this should be emphasized in South-South cooperation, just as yesterday Professor Debbie mentioned to Palestinian government officials. Probably you need to share your experiences in dealing with conflict to partner countries. So this should certainly be emphasized. And that's the comparative advantage of South-South cooperation, I think. And also can, to cater into this local context. And the second, I think, is we should emphasize on the part of efforts to mobilize local resources. This is very important to the sustainability issues. We are doing a very small project in Tanzania, and we give very little input and just use kind of, very simple, manageable, labor-intensive technologies. But we rely on local resources to do that. So if you measure the input in number is very small, but the impact is huge because we rely on these local resources, and we mobilize local universities, local government officials, and even village leaders to put their efforts to mobilize these projects. And I think if we have opportunities, we can show that project to you later. And the third one, we need to pay attention to the changing domestic politics of both partner countries of South Cooperation. I went to Tanzania last month. I saw this, they want to be independent. They really don't want to get rid of this kind of external reliance, and their Hapakazi too is their president's slogan for this. And even for provider countries like China, we are also facing these kind of accountability issues. So that's why we need a kind of international narratives. You're working as a kind of platform to see how can we balance the commercial interest and the of providers and the benefits of the recipient countries. So this is something really pragmatical. We need to advertise this kind of new pragmatism, and we need to think about this. If we want to form a kind of strong voice, we need to pay attention to what kind of advantages we do have for South cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I call for Hao. Hao, you? You're second, right? Hao, you're second. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, three, yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4.
I'll get close, don't worry. No, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I won't speak on the name of the DAC because I'm just part of the Secretariat or the Directorate of Development Cooperation, but I think this conversation is very interesting, and I think we're going to get very close to a final agreement at some point in the very short time. Just a couple of points, and I'll try to be very short. One is, I think there is a process of convergence, and some of you have mentioned some of the ways the OECD the DAC has set the standards in the past were quite static for many, many years, but now we see tensions in three areas. One, in the discussion of how do we account for inputs of development cooperation. And there are a lot of pressures and debates and disagreements within the DAC on how to complement the measurement of ODA or questioning the way the ODA is mentioned. And that hasn't been solved and probably will take a long time to solve, but it's reflecting a need to account for more than ODA as well in terms of what development cooperation means. The second is measuring processes, and several, including Dr. Depp, have been discussing how the Paris Effectiveness Agenda and the Busan Principles have been interpreted in the context of the DAC and the OECD as a series of commitments that Northern donors commit to deliver. But this is also in question. For example, for Sweden, only 11% of their program can apply this. You can apply these principles and monitor the effectiveness of these principles according to the Busan. Everything else goes through NGOs, bypassing partner country governments, or to the multilateral system. So it's out of the picture. So even donors are not seen, the North are not seen reflected in these commitments, and are trying to rethink. Let's open up this discussion again, because effectiveness today cannot mean what it meant back in 2005, no? So I think it's also an opportunity for the South to shape that agenda and find some kind of new consensus which is needed. And the third point is on the results and the effects and the impacts of development cooperation. Here as well, there is a lot of tension. There was a traditional results-based management approach, and we have been discussing the log frame and results frameworks and how do you monitor and evaluate that. That is also in question. So, and there is a big disagreement also within the DAC. Some donors want more adaptability and flexibility and react on real time to challenges in trying to achieve the results. Others are more traditional, orthodox, of like, let's continue with the results-based management systems. We haven't met the standard of results-based management system yet, and that's why it doesn't deliver. Even when they discuss on the evaluation criteria of the DAC for evaluations, that used to be 5, the debate around how to adapt this to the present have incorporated a new criteria, which is coherence, which means it's not just about the project or program that you have that needs to be effective, but also in coherence with your trade policy, your other projects, etc. And that's also reflecting something that in the South was born, like it's more than just the specific development cooperation intervention. It's the sum of all the policies that affect the relationship with another partner. So that's the first point. I think those debates and tensions inside the DAC even are offering an opportunity for convergence with the debates here. And the second is on the legitimacy issue, maybe not to repeat the errors of the DAC, for example. And as Mario was saying yesterday, one problem with the DAC is that it was only listening to itself from the very beginning. Many of the commitments, like the anti-date commitment, was born as a commitment of the donors for the donors themselves. So it was a commitment that they made to themselves because they also saw that tying aid for them had less value added, 30% less of value added than opening procurement processes to also local providers. How do you solve that? By bringing back to the table those countries that are mostly recipient or beneficiary countries of cooperation. Those are the ones that are best positioned also to indicate what changes you as a donor should do so it's more effective, sustainable, and impactful what you do in benefiting them. So it's also a way in which you make demand-driven commitments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I start this line, I'd like to especially invite Mario. You make your contribution. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am very much interested in this discussion, and I think the quality is particularly high, and I'm very happy about that. But let me make a first generic consideration. Being in a certain sense a Martian, because it's the first time that I participate to the meeting, is somehow interesting to notice that you start by saying there is a new phase. GDPC did not implement its objective, as Gerardo has clarified to us. But then we continue to refer to the GDPC as an existing and structured issue or activities. In a certain sense, this risk to create a ghost in the discussion. Stated that, I would like to pinpoint an element that appeared in the last intervention as well that I think is also crucial to understand the situation in which the previous experiences failed. And this has to do with voice. There is an issue related to the Busan process that was concerning rules, agreements, categories to be introduced in cooperation. But there was also a second dimension that has been strongly highlighted by Mary Robinson in the report that she wrote as chair of an high-level panel of the DAC promoted by Eric Solheim. If you read that report, Mary Robinson mainly says, the world has changed, cooperation changed, the DAC no. And therefore, the DAC should go further towards the other countries, the other actors that are you, more or less. Now, in that report, she also indicated some possibilities to open up. And fundamentally, how do we create a table where other actors sit together? Not other, where the actors sit together. This element of voice, the participation of the different actors in the discussion, is crucial. Now, she concluded by saying, the DAC, between openness and like-mindedness, will always choose like-mindedness. And therefore, the DAC in itself will not provide that table. You may read, in a certain sense, the global partnership as the effort to add somebody else, not exactly at the DAC table, but to a kind of secondary table called differently. So, under my point of view, if we are here discussing for a new type of approach, in order also to be hegemonic in the Gramscian sense, I mean, not dominant, if you want to be hegemonic, therefore there is a crucial point to be addressed, that is, what table do we want to create? How do we define a new table with rules, and then we call the actor to sit? In this respect, I am very much persuaded that the issue of, and by the way, our friends from New York University was very explicit when he saw the very interesting movie about the global partnership for triangular cooperation. Is that when I look at the actors there, it seems to me that these are the traditional donors. No? So how can we make a proposal that is different from that type of suggestion so that the table is effective? Why I'm saying so? Because of legitimacy. The issue of legitimacy, we did not work with the GDPC for the fact that the table from the beginning was built in. We are the donors and we invite the recipient. As if they tell me, in Italy, we build a table and then we invite you from the north of Italy. I mean, am I part of the table or am I not? Why should I have a differentiation in this respect? It seems much more a process in which you create a negotiating table than a policy dialogue table for building things. So it seems to me that the shape of the table would be particularly important. And if we create a second table with a donor of the South-South cooperation, then will be a big, big problem, political problem. In particular, when it comes to accountability. Because then what does it mean? That we discuss the accountability to the public opinion and the parliament of the donors country of the South that provide the money? And therefore, there is a big issue. So for me, together with the rules and the principles and the modalities, there is also an important issue, which is the table, and the way in which it does work. It will work.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you very much. Because the issue here for the GPTCE is that we're suspicious that GPTCE is another type of surviving strategy in the new context. This is something which southern country quite suspicious for active taking for this one. After I finish this here, and I go for you, okay? I promise to, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Chair, for the floor. I'm Nazir from the Biruni Institute, a think tank based in Kabul, Afghanistan, where Afghanistan has been a case for the $140 billion ODA, 3 times as much as the original Marshall Plan, bigger than the Marshall Plan, unprecedented in the history of humankind. A case of $140 billion development assistance by the North in particular. I agree with the failure of the practices related to the aid effectiveness, Busan, Accra, and the rest. Similarly, at the country level, this exercise has been expensive, time-consuming, with huge transaction costs attached to it. To the extent that we are told this is the philosophy of the gift. Either take it or leave it. One of our major partners explained in a meeting that they are satisfied with the results overall. There's not much need for the accountability in issues involving aid effectiveness. Working with the 40+ international development partners, we developed a beautifully written aid management policy at the Ministry of Finance that took us 5 years. At the end, with all these changes in international aid effectiveness narratives and the failures, they came in and told us that this is a non-binding document. With all these principles, Paris and Accra and Busan and the rest embedded in the document. The fatigue, of course, is there. We confirmed this at the country level. On the South-South cooperation, I posed a number of challenges in the first day of the conference when I spoke in my session, with some particular plea and examples. Adding to that, for the sake of clarification, is South-South cooperation already on budget? That's not the case in my country. Are they utilizing the country systems? No. We have no single data in any of the government ministries on the figures and the amount and volume of South-South cooperation, particularly from those powerful joints in our region, and their modality and the way they have developed their programs. Some of them are, of course, focused on infrastructure, but with no figures and data, or with no engagement of the government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, for you. Yeah, you. Yeah, and then you continue. Yeah, then you continue. No, this after. Yeah, yeah. Go this way. I mean, mine here. Not interfere with my right?
Thank you, Chair. Well, I agree with Dave, and it's particularly on the scope on what we are going to measure, but in South-South cooperation, and that measurement should indicate its impact in development process. And I also agree with him on revisiting DAC framework, and also decompose common but differentiated responsibilities. And here, when we are talking about common but differentiated responsibilities, there are two components. One component is common. That is, it has to be common for all South-South countries. And another component is differentiated. So how we are going to decompose this common and differentiated responsibilities? And for common, there has to be some central obligation that is equally applicable to all countries, irrespective of level of development. For example, it could be, as my colleague indicated, that's the domestic resource mobilization. That could be common. Or maybe on trade investment policy. That could be common. Or maybe carbon emission. That could be common. Or governance. That could be common. And on differentiated part, I suggest, the one component could be implementation issues. Implementation, depending on the level of development, economic, status and administrative capabilities. And that ensures, that flexibility ensures, we are talking about ownership or demand-driven. That ensures that kind of ownership if we have flexibility and implementation. And the third component could be support from the more advanced countries of the South to less advanced countries in the South. That could be through financial resources, that could be through technology transfer, or that could be through technical assistance. So maybe while we are decomposing these things, I think we need to address that common and differences components. Okay, I stop over here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moskov. You, and I would like to identify you next. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Excellent deliberations and a lot of learning and insights for me. Now, they've challenged us to identify what could be the development effectiveness. But I would like to go a step backward, and in order to identify what could be the elements of development effectiveness, I think in the context of the South-South cooperation, we have to think about the nature of the development cooperation before going for development effectiveness. And I'd like to argue that it has to be it has to be seen in a dynamic sense. Let us not forget that when we are talking about South-South cooperation, we are talking about, whether it is partnership or not, I am not going into that, but there is a provider country, there is a receiving country. It may be win-win, but there is that distinction. Now, that providing country is also a developing country. Now, for example, we have done, and Deb was leading that study, with respect to coherence, and I'm very happy that Alejandro raised the point. Now, we looked at Indian line of credit to Bangladesh and examined it from the point of coherence. Now, India, is giving line of credit to Bangladesh, 3 lines of credit, $8 billion, concessional loan. But India has one of the largest concentration of poverty in the world. And it has to be accountable to its parliament also, the government, that it is providing, for example, loans to a concessional loan to a country. At the same time, it also has its many developmental demands. Okay, so I think that part when we are defining effectiveness, we will have to keep that part also. And we were looking at the Indian line of credit, and you see, for example, there is generally it is not there when you are getting money from the North. There is an upfront, for example, service charge with the Exim Bank charges, number 1. Number 2, in the first line of credit, for example, 85% of the procurement has to be from the provider country, meaning India. You see, but when the third line of credit came, and Bangladesh said that we have a problem because we also have our domestic, service providers which could also provide that service at a competitive rate, it was brought down to 65%. So I think that as India also progresses, the issues of coherence will also have to be looked at in a dynamic sense, because the provider country is also in a unique specific position. So I would like to say that when we are talking about development effectiveness in South-South cooperation, I think that the nature of the relationship between a developing country, perhaps advanced developing country, and another developing country, perhaps a low-income country. So that specificity and the dynamics of the provider country and its economic scenario. For example, Brazil, it was an emerging country. Now we are hearing that it has become a submerging country. So how do you really look at it? Do you apply the same metrics of development effectiveness, Brazil vis-a-vis, for example, another country 5 years back and now, or perhaps 5 years from now? So I think that element of perhaps flexibility or volatility, I don't know how we define, that has to be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and then Maria, you also raised hand, right? After,
Andrea, I think.
And then you.
Yeah.
3, okay.
Thank you, Professor Lee. I just want to raise a concern on our debate and a call of attention on one particular point. We might remind that the literature about aid effectiveness is not concluent or is not clear at all on aid effectiveness. However, I think one of the aim of the Delhi process and the NEST and many initiatives we have been dealing with put in the table the need to create more data for South-South cooperation. So I will ask to maybe urge in this process to really focus our debates on maybe a next meeting or to prepare a next process, focus on how we can clarify maybe trying, I don't know if as we were talking, to have a standard template or something that can facilitate us to really try to see what is happening, to have some evidence, because I think we have discussed in the next context the need of evidence and the need of data from South-South cooperation. Unless we don't have this, we cannot talk about effectiveness and we cannot see how powerful is or not South-South cooperation, because it's the same problem that we have with the ODA debate on effectiveness. So I think we need to urge this process. And in this point, the point that I would like to raise is that we shouldn't forget, of course, reality. We have shared that reality is there and sometimes it's beyond theories and everything. And I think BAPA 40 offers a milestone on these issues, because in this idea of convergence of what is happening on these debates, we don't need to lose that the 2030 agenda is there, and that could be, we have discussed as well this with Gerardo, a set of indicators that should be incorporated in any template about South-South cooperation. And at the same time, the 2030 agenda could be a parameter for us, because we are not talking about aid effectiveness anymore. We are talking about development effectiveness, where all of us can fit together. So I think that's a part. And don't forget, of course, as well, the policy and economic cycle that creates this instability and uncertainty. And finally, the aspects related that were discussed in the Delhi 5, related with technology, how this is Industry 4.0, no? How this is changing a lot of things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maria, yeah. And then for you. Yes. Maria, yeah.
I'd like to say some comments about what Professor Sachin said before, that quantification is possible. I would start saying that the way to show effectiveness is through results. And to read these results, it's necessary to agree some sort of measurement. One of my concerns is how to escape positivism when it is required to show effectiveness in South-South cooperation, development cooperation. Maybe it is time to reach a minimal agreement about some variables and indicators as a way to measure what results we want to accomplish. But in order to look for a way of measurements, first we need to agree what is South-South cooperation. In this regard, the Development Compact, as Sachin has coined, as a theoretical construct for South-South cooperation, could become the common framework or a starting point for measurement. Nevertheless, and in this point I agree with Professor Mustafizur, as taking South-South trade as one of the pillars of the Development Compact, we should be aware that if we measure South-South trade, it is important to address that it's not the same to do it between two countries of the same level of development or two countries with complementary economies. Despite the fact that some raw material producers can have trade surplus with more industrialized trade partners, it will be in the short term. And to a certain extent, this case of South-South trade could deepen the domestic extractivist model. Therefore, the capability of South-South trade to generate a positive impact becomes blurred. In other words, I think it is important to consider the different levels of development between partners when we measure the effectiveness of development cooperation actions. And as a final comment, maybe a solution could be to analyze case studies between Southern development partnerships as a methodological approach to apply similar bilateral partnerships. In this way, we are taking into account the particular characteristics which could be overshadowed in more general approaches.
Thank you. Andrew, finally.
Thank you, Lee. It seems to me that the problem of aid effectiveness or development cooperation effectiveness is primarily a political one. It's not a technical one. And a large part of the discussion here has focused on technical challenges. So let me try to frame the debate on a broader political and historical approach from this perspective, if I may. The aid effectiveness agenda arose after the end of the Cold War, in the 1990s to be more particular. And it did so because at that time, the geopolitical imperatives of aid were loosened or removed. So we could focus on aid effectiveness per se, given that these geopolitical imperatives were no longer there between the two disputing blocs right? And at the same time, we had a number of studies that showed that aid had not made that much of a difference in terms of development at that time, and looked at conditions where aid could be more effective, primarily at institutions. There's some very important studies that came out at the time, one in particular by David Dollar, and that spurred also the issue of conditionalities, on how to impose conditionalities that would increase the effectiveness of aid, primarily related to the quality of institutions and the quality of governance. So this was a major transition period, and that's the origin of this agenda, or at least that's the point where it gained political weight. It seems to me that now we're in another transition period, and that has to do with what Sachin called the rise of the South. Right? So we have countries that are rising in power. We have a new distribution of power, if you will, and we have countries that are declining relatively in terms of their dominance, most notably the US, but also Europe and others. And it is in this context where we have the failure of this agenda, at least in terms of how it is embedded in global institutions, right? And particularly the failure of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, which has been discussed here by Gerardo and by Stefan and by others. It is in this context that we have the fatigue of the North in wanting to engage with this agenda, or an unwillingness of the North. It is also in this context that we have what Paulo and others and Stefan have been calling the southernization of the North, which basically seems to be, we're going to loosen now the norms and standards for effectiveness that we have. We're going to adopt a looser standard of the South. And you know, the South itself has no alternative coherent structure or standards or norms to propose in its turn. So we end up with a situation that is the absence of standards or norms. Right? And that is the absence of institutions where these standards and norms can be embedded, which also, I think, speaks to Mario's presentation when he says, what is the table? Well, what is the table is, from my perspective, primarily an issue of what is the global governance of aid effectiveness or development cooperation effectiveness? And at this point, we have none, and the ones that we were trying to build collapsed. So again, I think this is the major challenge. And if we can agree on the agenda, if we can set up an institution that provides this table for negotiation, for building, then I think the technical challenges will become a lot more manageable, and they can be overcome. And I'll stop here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really, as you rightly point out, as also Maria said, you know, this is really, really refers to the issue of global governance. You know, this new structure of global governance. Otherwise, you know, very difficult. So I come to you, and then after here, I go you there, and then I come to these lines. Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm Dima from the Palestinian International Cooperation Agency. Actually, I just wanted to highlight maybe our country perspective toward the different concepts of ownership and demand-driven. Actually, for us, for example, on the contrary, we found that ownership played a very positive role in enhancing the South-South cooperation. For us, for example, how we deal with both concepts, for example. Usually where we offer any possibility and willingness to create a South-South cooperation with a country, usually they provide a demand for a need, a specific need related to a specific field of development. And on the other hand, we also provide our menu or our fields of competitive advantage, let's say fields that we can offer in this field. And once we have an agreement on both sides, we create this development cooperation program. So we believe that both concepts are, we could do like a balance between both concepts. And if we will look at how it really really played a role in fulfilling the identity of Palestine, because we used to do such programs but on an individual level, that meaning on a personal, on a private sector. Once we are doing it from a country to a country, organized under South-South cooperation, it reflects a better commitment and a different level of commitment in this transfer of knowledge or in this field of South-South cooperation. On the other hand, it's very important to reflect the commitment we are doing to mobilize local limited resources for ownership perspective. And this was one of the important issues that we realized, even if it's our perspective only through 4 years old agency, but this is how we look at it. Maybe another, just to highlight one more note about the development effectiveness. For us, it's a bit flexible, meaning if both countries are happy and they feel that they are fulfilling development local need that contributes to achieving the agenda of 2030, we are happy with it. Even if it's not a very sophisticated, measured framework, for example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to make a few points on the practical realities for a country like Sri Lanka, for instance. We have transitioned from relying on traditional sources of assistance to being heavily reliant on new lenders, non-traditional sources in the span of a decade. And the transition really has indicated some of the key issues that have been highlighted around the table this morning. First point is resistance to traditional donors. Sri Lanka is really seeing a pushback against funding from USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, funding from the EU through GSP Plus, etc., because of the very tight conditionalities that come with assistance, either through boost or promote particular economic policy reforms, or even institutional and governance reforms at the national level. So we have transitioned to relying very heavily on new donors like China, and also increasingly also India. But that also comes with its own sets of problems. And I want to refer to a point that Deb made about ownership versus being demand-driven. The reality is that very little of assistance that has come via the new or non-traditional donors is demand-driven at country level. It is demand-driven at the national level, and it has really led to a whole host of other problems in terms of debt sustainability and many other issues that I think have, where Sri Lanka has been highlighted as a country that's struggling to deal with these new forms of development finance that comes our way. And one thing is, when you look at the new non-traditional donors, their competing interests and strategic rivalries also means that effectiveness of that assistance is also compromised. And I'll give an example of, for instance, Indian investments coming into buying up airports that are non-functioning, etc., not on any rational economic sort of decisions, but purely on strategic interests. So when looking at effectiveness of the new donors, we are also looking project-wise and coming to a conclusion. For instance, we have 2 or 3 large projects that are that have been making huge losses. But at the same time, effectiveness needs to be looked at in a broader framework, because when we look at economic relations, and I agree that the term should be more economic because it encompasses trade, it encompasses investments, capacity that comes with migration of labor that's brought in. So the entire effectiveness program is at a broader macro level rather than at a project level, which was the way in which we measured effectiveness with the traditional donors. So the whole sort of discussion of what went wrong with traditional aid effectiveness measures and processes, I see a lot of that being repeated in the new non-traditional donors who are also entering and engaging, where countries like mine, where we don't have systematic institutional structures, are repeating and making the same mistakes.
Thank you, Professor Khatun. Yeah, and then we'll start you and Elizabeth and you. Okay.
Microphone.
Isn't that fun? Oh, sorry.
Red is green, green is red.
Thank you. I learned a lot. I just don't, I mentioned. Yeah, I thought that instead of getting into the battle of the giants, I would just tell you what is my take home from the discussion here and also the last 2 days, and not less significantly, the young scholars' presentations. In the context of the issue of common but differentiated responsibility, also the last objective which has been stated is that how the efforts at measurement can create tensions, which has been hinted by Mustafikur as well as Doshi in the context of the new relationship. Now, what does it mean, rise of Asia? Rise of Asia, on the one hand, certainly means donors coming up. In fact, within the South, and in fact, in the presentations in the morning by the young scholars, they mentioned how some countries in the South are coming up. This is new pragmatism reflected in the higher share of loans coming from the non-traditional donors. But there has been a significant inequality within the South. 2020 is not 1955. Also, what we notice, in fact, this was mentioned in the discussion in the morning, that private sector participation has gone up now compared to 30, 40 years ago, and their role would also be there in the South-South cooperation. How does the government rule that? So basically, there are tensions coming up even within the new relationship. I entirely agree with Sachin that, it's impossible to have this same kind of a framework as OECD framework or the North-South cooperation framework. It is neither desirable nor possible to bring it in South-South cooperation. But at the same time, to say that there should be no measurement and South-South cooperation should be really, of course, the larger principles should be there. The moment you bring in strict benefit cost analysis that comes for each project, that comes into conflict with the basic principles of South-South cooperation. But at the same time, I just wanted to bring in the results of a study that I was associated with in the context of identifying demand-driven projects in the health sector in the South Asian countries in the framework of cost of inaction, the framework which has been used by Sudhir Anand and Amartya Sen in evaluating, again, health projects in Africa, in Angola, and Rwanda. I just want to bring those results, and I'll stop at that. What was brought out in this study by Sudhir Anand and Amartya Sen was also overviewing, is that
there are certain projects which have non-measurable outcomes. Obviously, we know that there are many dimensions of South-South cooperation which cannot be measured that in the policy space. And some projects do get rejected as a result of non-quantification of these, very important outcomes. But what emerges very clearly, that a large number of projects within the South, within the framework, which I think it fits in within the compact framework, a large number of projects can be easily identified on the basis of the measurable data. And we can say that even if other aspects are not measurable, they should be included. In the Indian context also, in the South Asian countries, there are a large number of projects with some minimum level of measurement which is possible. It is possible to argue that these are the projects which qualify. So although I entirely agree that there are dimensions in South-South cooperation which are not measurable in the policy space, in the context of new value creation, trust, but based on the existing data, as it has been shown in the case of African countries, it is possible to build up a case for selection of large number of projects even without full quantification of the benefits. That is the point I would like to bring into consideration, that although we entirely agree that all aspects cannot be measured, and if you try to do that for each project, you violate the South-South cooperation principle. But based on the existing level of information, we are losing a lot more of the new projects. It is possible to identify the project based on the given data that certainly qualify on the basis of the principles of South-South cooperation. Thank you.